Well, it's really great to be with you all, and it's very impressive. I think everybody turned out to see Jennifer, and it's a real tribute to CBRE, and I'm very proud to be part of CBRE. And I'll probably talk a little bit about, I'm not here to kind of sell you on what I'm doing, but I think it's informative in the context of what I'm going to talk about and how I see the world today. I started off with this slide, and usually on an introduction, I'm using slides just in case you get bored looking at me or hearing me, and also in case I forget what I wanted to tell you. But usually on an introductory slide, there's just the introduction, my name or the name of our company. But I included a quote from a very good friend of mine who published a book called The Age of the Unthinkable, and his name's Josh Ramo. And for those of you who like to read, it's a new book. It just came out this year. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for a while. It's incredibly thought-provoking. Josh runs Asia for Kissinger Associates and is the senior advisor to the Chinese government. And his perspective, before that he was the youngest editor of Time magazine, foreign editor, and his perspective on what's going on in the world today, because obviously we all are living through these turbulent and very uncertain times, and it's exciting, it's scary, and Josh's, I read his book, and it really helped me put into perspective some of the societal changes that we see playing out globally, and helped me put in perspective, I think, to the business world as well. So I excerpted a quote from his book, which I thought was particularly germane to what we're talking about today and what we're all thinking about, which is this paradigm change that we're seeing in the world today. The last time that I saw this, and I think we all saw this, was in the early 1990s in what we like to refer to as the savings and loan crisis. But for those of us who were there and remember, it was really a global financial crisis. The savings and loans just happened to be sacrificed. They were the lambs that didn't survive that period of time. But it was the last time that there was a major paradigm shift in global finance. And we're going through another one of those now, and arguably a much more severe and much more scary time than then. Josh's quote goes to the point that when these times occur, people that hold on to the old models and use the past as a framework for trying to figure out where we're going are oftentimes left in the dust. And I think that's true. In my career, I've always found the greatest joy is to be thinking on the edge and to be challenged to think out of the box. And I think for most of a cycle, that's not terribly rewarding. If you try to think out of the box in 2005, 6, and 7, you didn't really do very much. You should have been thinking in the box. But now we're at a time when thinking out of the box is, I think, imperative, and really that's what this quote is meant to reflect. I'm going to talk to you about a number of things, and I haven't figured all of it out yet. And I'm going to leave a fair bit of time afterwards for question and answer, and I would really encourage you to participate in that. It's generally the most fun part. It's the part I like the most. It's very hard, and I think impossible, to understand where we are today in real estate, which I think most everybody here is in the real estate business, without first understanding it in the proper context of where the world is in finance. Because we are clearly in a crisis, and have been for a number of years, having very little to do with real estate, having everything to do with finance. And so I'm going to spend the first few minutes of this discussion putting a kind of a little bit of a history lesson on how I see finance. And I see life as a continuum, right? So, people tend to focus on the immediate situation, right? There was the subprime crash, and there was you could make the links on there into ultimately the decimation of our economy, the undermining of rents and occupancies and all that stuff. But I look at where we are today in the context of a longer story that's been playing out. And so I look really from the very beginning of my career to now, the major theme in finance has been the success of securitization. Securitization is rather new. It was really something that was born in the home mortgage finance business. It began really in the late 70s and didn't take off until the 80s. And again, focused through the 80s almost entirely on the business of home mortgage finance. And since that time, since the 1980s, when securitization took a foothold into the business, it has inexorably displaced the traditional portfolio lending model as the prime deliverer of capital to business, to assets. And so it started off with, and that's been the big story of the last 25 or so years. And so it started back, as I said, in home mortgage finance. And if you think about back then, the S&L crisis, well, home mortgage finance was their only business, right? An S&L, for those of you who don't remember, an S&L was a bank, simply put. They just took insured deposits just like a bank. But unlike banks, they were only allowed to invest in one asset, and that was a home mortgage. That's it. And when securitization came about, largely, initially entirely in home mortgage finance, and largely subsidized by the government through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the securitization model really displaced the home mortgage lending business that was the S&L's sole domain. And by the early 1980s, they found themselves crowded out by a more efficient delivery system of capital to the home mortgage borrower. Their business basically went away. And confronted with that, they did what any of us would do in order to survive, which is challenge themselves to figure out how we're going to change our business model. And they hired lobbyists, they went to Congress, and they petitioned Congress to broaden their investment mandate. And so by 1982, 1983, Congress passed liberalizing laws allowing S&Ls to invest in a broad array of investments that up until that time they couldn't invest in, including junk bonds, land development, commercial real estate, all kinds of stuff that they had no experience and no expertise in. And they took insured deposits, which should have not been exposed arguably to that level of risk, certainly not with that level of, let's say, lack of experience and expertise. And the story ultimately was inevitable. They lost all our money, okay? And they crashed and burned. And not only did the savings and loan crash and burn, but by taking insured deposits, which is the cheapest form of capital because they're borrowing on our collective guarantee, and our collective guarantee is still very good. Maybe our individual guarantee is not good anymore, but our collective guarantee is still pretty good. Borrowing on our collective guarantee and taking that subsidized, inexpensive capital and pouring it into markets like junk bonds, markets like real estate land development, markets like commercial real estate, they actually crowded out the private sector money because the private sector money couldn't compete. And so they forced the private sector money. When you take cheap subsidized money and you put it into a market against private sector money is forced to take greater risks, push the edge of the envelope, leverage their balance sheets more, go out on their risk spectrum. And so not only did the S&Ls cost us $500 billion in taxpayer cleanup, but they created a much wider crisis. They created the bubble.